23. There is something strange about looking in the mirror at 23 and seeing what your grandfather saw at 60. Most people call it bad luck. Some call it genetics, vaguely. Tanta, dismissively, the way people invoke genetics when they want to stop thinking about something. But scientists have been quietly pulling at this thread for years, and what they've found is not a simple answer. It is something far older, far stranger, and far more human than anyone expected, because the story of why some people lose their hair early is not really a story about hair. It is a story about ancient migrations. It is a story about populations that merged thousands of years before the first city was built. It is a story written not on skin or scalp, but in the genome, in fragments of inherited code so old they predate recorded history by tens of thousands of years. That's when researchers began examining the genetics of early onset hair loss across populations, comparing modern DNA against ancient genomes pulled from burial sites, from bones preserved in permafrost, from teeth found in caves. What they uncovered complicated everything the dermatology textbooks had said. The old story was clean. The new story is not. For most of modern medical history, the explanation for androgenetic alopecia, what most people simply call male pattern baldness or early hair loss, was considered relatively well understood. The mechanism was clear enough. A hormone called dihydrotestosterone, or DHT, binds to receptors in certain hair follicles and gradually shrinks them over time. Follicles that are genetically sensitive to DHT begin to miniaturize, producing thinner, shorter hairs until eventually they stop producing hair altogether. The gene variants responsible for much of this sensitivity were identified. The androgen receptor gene on the X chromosome, meaning the version you inherited from your mother, was long considered the dominant player. This is why, for decades, the folk wisdom held that a man should look at his maternal grandfather to predict his own hairline. If your mother's father kept a full head of hair into his 70s, the reasoning went, you would likely do the same. It was a tidy story. It had the satisfying logic of inheritance, a clear line, a traceable path, except it was incomplete. And the deeper scientists looked, the more populations they sampled. The more ancient genomes they compared, the more apparent it became that the old story had been built on a limited archive, a too narrow slice of humanity. A sample that reflected certain populations and not others, certain ancestries, and not the full sweep of human migration. The X-linked explanation was real, but it was only part of the picture. Hence, the first sign that something was missing came not from a laboratory, but from a demographic pattern that researchers kept noticing and couldn't fully explain. The rates of early onset hair loss were not evenly distributed across populations. Well, they clustered. They were higher in some groups and lower in others, and the distribution didn't map neatly onto geography or diet or any obvious environmental factor. East Asian men, on average, experienced lower rates of androgenetic alopecia than men of European descent. Some West African populations showed different patterns still. Men from certain South Asian communities displayed high rates that seemed inconsistent with their immediate regional neighbors. Now, this kind of variation in a trait is not unusual. Lots of traits vary across populations. But the question that genetic researchers eventually turned their tools toward was whether this distribution was random or whether it was telling a story about ancient human movements. Because variation in trait frequency across populations is not just noise. It is often a signal of ancestry, a signal of migration, a signal of populations mixing, separating and carrying different genetics baggage across continents and across millennia. And in this case, the signal was pointing somewhere unexpected. Genome-wide association studies, large-scale efforts to scan thousands of individuals and identify genetic variants associated with specific traits began producing results that reshaped the hair loss story significantly. These studies don't just look at one gene, they scan millions of positions across the entire genome simultaneously, and what they found as the data sets grew larger and more globally representative. And was that the genetics of hair loss were far more distributed than anyone had assumed. It wasn't just the androgen receptor on the X chromosome. Researchers began identifying dozens, and eventually hundreds of genetic variants spread across multiple chromosomes, each contributing a small but real effect to the likelihood of early hair loss. Some of these variants were ancient, deeply ancient. When researchers compared these variants against ancient DNA databases, genomes extracted from archaeological remains across Eurasia, Africa, and the Americas, some of the hair loss associated variants appeared to have frequencies that tracked not with modern populations in isolation, but with the ancestry streams that fed into them thousands of years ago. One interpretation was beginning to take shape, a troubling and fascinating one. If you subscribe to this channel because stories like this interest you, where science opens a window into history that no one expected, hit subscribe. There is far more buried in the human genome than most of us realize, and we are only beginning to read it. Let's slow down here, because to understand what the ancient DNA evidence was suggesting, it helps to understand where modern humans actually came from. The story of human ancestry is not a story of pure isolated groups moving cleanly through history. It is a story of repeated collisions, of populations meeting in corridors and on coasts and across mountain passes, mixing for generations, separating, drifting apart, and then meeting again. Modern Europeans, for instance, are not a single ancient population. They are the product of at least three major ancestry streams. Hunter-gatherers who lived in Europe before farming arrived. Anatolian farmers who migrated in from what is now Turkey roughly 9,000 years ago. And steppe pastoralists often associated with cultures like the Yamnaya, who swept in from the Pontic-Caspian steppe roughly 5,000 years ago. These were not small admixtures. Each wave reshaped the genetic landscape of the continent profoundly. South Asians carry their own layered history, ancient hunter-gatherer ancestry, Iranian farmer-related ancestry, and the same steppe signal found in Europe. East Asians carry traces of ancient populations that diverged from Western Eurasians tens of thousands of years ago, but also carry evidence of later Bronze Age movements and contacts. Every modern population is, in this sense, a palimpsest, a document written over and over by different hands, with each layer preserving traces of what came before. And hair loss genetics, researchers were beginning to suspect, might be one of those preserved traces. Here is where the story starts to widen in ways that are genuinely difficult to fully explain. When researchers began comparing the populations with the highest frequencies of early hair loss associated variants against ancient DNA ancestry profiles, a pattern started to emerge. Populations with higher frequencies of certain hair loss variants tended to carry higher proportions of ancestries from specific ancient source populations, particularly from ancestry streams associated with the early farmers of the ancient Near East, and the steppe migrations of the Bronze Age. This is not a simple cause and effect statement. The relationship is probabilistic. It is complicated by centuries of admixture and genetic drift. Venture cautious. Scientists are cautious, correctly cautious, about drawing straight lines between ancient ancestry and modern traits. But the signal was there, and it raised a question that researchers are still working to answer. And were some of these genetic variants hitchhiking carried along not because hair loss was selected for, but because they were sitting near other variants that were Ashver? This concept, known as linkage disequilibrium, is one of the more counterintuitive ideas in population genetics. Variants that are physically close together on a chromosome tend to be inherited together. So if natural selection was strongly favoring one variant, perhaps because it conferred an advantage in vitamin D metabolism, or in immune function, or in hormone regulation, neighboring variants could ride along for the journey, sure, even if they had no direct adaptive value of their own. In other words, some of the genetic architecture underlying early hair loss might not have been selected for at all. It may have been a passenger. There are at least 3 frameworks researchers have proposed to explain how the genetic variants associated with hair loss came to be distributed the way they are across modern populations. The first is straightforward selective neutrality. Under this model, the variants associated with hair loss are simply byproducts of ancestry. They're more common in some populations because those populations happen to descend more heavily from ancient groups where the variants were more common. No selection involved, pure demographic history. The second framework involves pleiotropy, the phenomenon where one gene or variant affects multiple traits simultaneously. Several of the variants associated with androgenetic alopecia are also associated with testosterone metabolism, skin biology, and inflammatory response. It is entirely possible, and researchers have raised this explicitly, that some of these variants were selected for their effects on other traits entirely, and their influence on hair follicles was, in an evolutionary sense, irrelevant. The third framework is more speculative but impossible to dismiss, that in certain ancestral environments, the physical or hormonal changes associated with these variants may have conferred real advantages. For instance, high DHE sensitivity, for instance, may have been linked to musculature, aggressive immune response, or even wound healing. Ancient environments were not gentle. Selection does not optimize for aesthetics. The genome does not know about mirror anxiety. It only knows about survival. The most striking piece of evidence in this entire investigation came from a landmark genome-wide association study that analyzed data from over 200,000 individuals across multiple global populations, one of the largest analyses of hair loss genetics ever conducted. And the study identified more than 300 independent genetic loci associated with androgenetic alopecia. 300, when earlier models had focused on a handful of key genes. The actual genetic architecture was proving to be massively distributed, involving genes related to cell signaling, hormone metabolism, skin development, and inflammatory pathways. But the most surprising finding was not the number of variants. It was the pattern of how those variants overlapped with specific ancient ancestry components. That's for sure. When researchers mapped the genetic risk scores across populations and compared them against detailed ancestry estimates. The populations with the highest polygenic risk scores for early hair loss showed disproportionately high ancestry from the Anatolian farmer stream. The ancient agricultural populations who spread across Europe and Western Asia beginning roughly 9,000 years ago. Not the steppe, not the hunter-gatherers, the farmers. This was not what most researchers had predicted. The steppe ancestry associated with the Yamnaya and their descendants had often been considered the more plausible source for high 8-8 associated traits because of the steppe population's known genetic relationship to certain hormonal pathways. Instead, the signal pointed to the agricultural transition, to the moment in human history when populations shifted from nomadic hunting to settled farming, a shift that brought enormous changes in diet, in environment, in pathogen exposure, in social structure. The genome was not erasing the old story, it was revealing an older one beneath it. Imagine a landscape in ancient Anatolia, what is now central Turkey, roughly 9,000 years ago, Erver. The hills are dotted with the earliest permanent settlements humanity had yet built. People are learning to live in place, to grow grain, to tend animals, to stay. The genetic signature of these people is now traceable. Ancient DNA extracted from burial sites in this region has confirmed their place in human history as one of the great founding populations of the modern world. Their descendants carrying their genes spread westward across Europe, eastward into Central Asia, and southward across the Near East. They moved slowly over generations, over centuries, and as they moved, they mixed with the people already there, the hunter-gatherers who had lived in these lands for tens of thousands of years. Among the genetic material they carried, among the hundreds of thousands of variants encoded in their genomes were markers. Markers that, many thousands of years later, would be associated with follicle sensitivity, with hormonal response, with the quiet, private grief of watching a hairline retreat in a bathroom mirror at 25. They didn't know they were carrying it. It had no meaning for them. Their descendants in the modern world would be the ones who gave it meaning. Why does any of this matter beyond curiosity? Miniature, because the hair loss story is, in miniature, a story about something enormous. The distribution of any trait across human populations is a record of where people came from, how they moved, who they met, and what selective pressures shaped their ancestors over thousands of generations. When you decode that distribution, when you follow the variants back through time and across continents, you are reading human history from the inside. There are no pure populations. There never were. Every person alive today is the product of ancient meetings between people who would not have recognized each other as kin. The genome is the only record of those meetings that survives in every living body. Early hair loss is not a flaw. It is an heirloom, a trace of a journey so old that no written history recorded it. No map preserved it, no oral tradition survived it, but the genome did. And that is the part that researchers are still grappling with. How many other traits, conditions, and biological tendencies that we treat as simple medical facts are actually echoes of population movements we haven't fully mapped? How many things we call personal are actually ancient? How many things we call inherited are actually archaeological? The genome is an archive, and we are only beginning to learn how to read it. The story is not finished. The 300 plus loci identified in the largest studies so far explain only a fraction of the total heritability of early hair loss. There are still large gaps regions of the genome that contribute to the trait but haven't been pinned down. There are still populations that are underrepresented in the data sets. meaning the global picture is still being built, and every new ancient genome sequenced, every new burial site excavated, every new tooth or bone yielding enough DNA to analyze adds another data point to a map that was, for most of human history, completely invisible. The man in the mirror at 23. Studying a hairline that wasn't there last year is not simply experiencing a medical phenomenon. He is experiencing the end of a very long chain, a chain that runs back through his grandparents, photographer, through their grandparents, through dozens of generations of you people who crossed mountains and rivers and seas, who built fires in landscapes that no longer exist, who carried inside them a particular arrangement of genetic letters that would eventually find its way through thousands of years of mixing and migration and survival into him. The history books don't record those people, but the genome does, and that might be the most important thing genetics has told us, that the human past is not stored in monuments or manuscripts alone. It is stored in every person alive today, quietly, patiently written in a language we are only now learning to read. Your ancestors were there in ways you cannot see, in ways no history has named. They are still here.